Hey everybody, it's Aima, and today I've been promoted to do my own video. It's no surprise that Hussein and I love to do all of our leases, but it is a lot of work. Sometimes we joke around that selling a home is actually easier than renting a home. So this video was inspired to make a brief description on what it is that we do when we're leasing out your home for you as a landlord. Even if you're a landlord that's thinking about renting your own home out by yourself, I think this video will be really helpful, but I'll walk you through what it is that Hussein and I do to find you the perfect tenant. So the very first thing we do is obviously collect documentation. The first thing is a rental application, which is basically a 2-page form that summarizes a tenant's entire life. It asks why they're looking to move, when they want to move by. It asks about who will be living in the house. It asks about your employment information, your supervisor, how much you make roughly, and if there's any big liabilities such as a car or, OSAP and things like that. So that 2-page rental documentation is basically a way to see how the tenant is describing their own life. That's not something that we rely on fully, obviously. So that brings me to my next thing, which is asking for an employment letter, which should be dated within 30 days of when you're actually reviewing this application. We also ask for number 3, at least 3 recent pay stubs. Number 4, we ask for a credit report. So not just a screenshot, but a credit score and a full credit report. And the last thing we ask for at least 1 ID for both applications, but eventually if you get further into the due diligence process, we do ask for 2 sets of IDs for both applicants. So the purpose once again is to collect all of this documentation and start your vetting process. The wonderful thing is that as realtors, we have access to things like the MLS system or land registry. So a lot of the information can be easily verified. For example, if someone's telling me to live on 123 Anywhere Street and it's owned by Aima, I can actually look into the system and see, hey, does this address actually exist? And is it actually owned by the person that the tenant says it's owned by? One other thing we can actually check for on MLS is if that address has been leased in the past, who it's been leased out by, and how much it was leased out for. So these 2 systems are actually super helpful, especially if they have been leased on MLS, to find out the accuracy of this information. The next thing we look for is their employment letter and obviously their pay stubs. We want to make sure that their pay stubs are actually adding to the amount that's written on the employment letter. The last thing we check is your credit report and your credit score. And I get it, sometimes, their situation, I empathize with those people that have been in a crisis before and they've started off a little bit rough and they're working on improving it. But the best thing is that a credit score and a credit report will be a great indication of how someone manages their money. For example, if you are seeing on their credit report that they use about 85% of their credit utilization, that they're barely making payments or just making the minimum payment, you kind of get an idea that they're already in a bit of a rut and may not be able to keep up with their financial obligations. Another thing I honestly really love about a credit report is the part where you get to see inquiries. So at the very end of the credit report, it tells you if there's ever been a hard check or a simple check on this person. Recently, I saw that someone had a credit check done on them by a company called Uplift Canada. And this credit check was on both the husband and the wife's application. When I looked into a little bit further, I found out that it's actually a company that does financing for cosmetic surgery. So that gave me a little bit of an idea that there is someone looking to do cosmetic surgery, which is totally fine, all for it. But it was interesting to see that they were going to take on a loan and they had to get a credit application done to get this process done. So that gave me a little bit of a, I don't want to say red flag, but a little bit of an iffy feeling that that's where they're kind of deciding to spend their credit and their money. So that's one example of why I think it's very important to look at the inquiries part of your credit report. Besides that, once we've collected all of this information and you're happy with what the score is, obviously if the score is 500, you're not going to get to the next process. But once you're happy with everything else, like for example, if you do the math and the income turns out to be $4,000 every month, but the home they're looking to lease is $3,000, you know that $1,000 is likely not enough to cover insurance, groceries, and some of the very basic, requirements. If you're not happy with how much they make, if you're not happy with the simple math, and you're not happy with the credit score, you know that there's nothing really much else for you to do. Beyond that, once you've collected all of this and you're happy with all of this information, this is when the time comes where you're actually going to call and verify that everything that you're seeing so far on paper actually makes sense. So I'll give you one quick example. I called someone who's been working at a restaurant. So I just called the restaurant's, landline directly just to get a little bit more information. Doing this due diligence and having a conversation with the restaurant owner, I found out that this person actually hadn't even worked at the restaurant in the last 2 years. And then, obviously curiosity sort of kicked in and I started digging in a little bit more. And I found out that they do work at the restaurant, but they're working for cash only because they want to avoid showing their ex-wife how much they make so they don't have to pay child benefits. So I find that yes, on paper everything can look great, but unless you call them and verify all of this information, you're never gonna feel 100% satisfied. And this was just one example to show you how important it is actually to make those phone calls. So like I said, you'd make calls with their employer's information, you'd make calls to their current landlord and make sure that they're paying rent on time, that they're leaving for the correct reasons and it's not because there's been some sort of dispute. So all these phone calls are just as important as reading a file. Beyond that, what we do is sweep social media. And I know it sounds a little bit creepy, but I am telling you that sweeping social media is actually one of the best things that we've added in our process. And it's not necessarily that you're checking them out to find something wrong or look for and pick something and be negative about it. In fact, a lot of the times we have felt more comfortable leasing out a home to someone after we saw their social media profile, because you got to see how family oriented they were, how cute their kids were, and how they spend, their weekends hanging out together. So social media is actually a great tool to find a lot more comfort than you didn't have before. It just puts sort of like a face to the name, and I think it's a wonderful tool that should be utilized. Beyond social media, obviously, we want to meet in person. We started this during COVID, but we were meeting virtually, but now that all of that is put behind us, we meet people in person. And this doesn't happen just with us and the tenant. We make sure that the landlord is available, that the tenant's agent's available as well, and we kind of make it like a quick meet and greet, and we meet at the house. Again, just like social media, the meeting is not meant to scrutinize anyone. It's actually just to kind of meet, have a conversation, because at this point, we already know the answers to a lot of questions, but the point is to meet and get an energy and get a feel that this is going to be the right tenant. Not just the right tenant, but the tenant gets a very good idea of what kind of landlord they're going to be dealing with. At the end of the day, it's a two-way relationship, so the tenant has to feel just as comfortable. In fact, there's been a couple of times where we're representing the landlord, we meet with the tenant, and the tenant actually backs out because they didn't get a good feeling. So I find this last step of meeting in person is super crucial. And like I said, if you didn't feel comfortable with the first 5 steps, you would definitely feel comfortable at this step, and you decide where you want to move on. Once we've met with them and everyone is comfortable with what they've seen, that's when we actually get the tenant's agent to write us an offer. So a lot of the times I find that people look at a home, they submit an application, and they submit an offer, side by side. We are not interested in getting an offer right away. We're also not interested in getting like $200 or $300 beyond what the lease price is. Our goal is simply to find someone that is normal. Anytime someone calls us and says what it is that you're looking for in an ideal tenant, I joke around and I say somebody normal. Someone that has a job, someone that has a good credit report, someone who's gonna be able to keep up with the payments and doesn't bother us. So that's the whole point. Meet in person, get an offer written, and at that point when you're signing your home away basically to this new tenant, you feel comfortable about everything else that you've done. One other thing I don't like when agents call us and ask about the criteria, they say, hey, we're ready to pay you 6 months upfront. Once I hear that, even if I was 10% convinced that you might be the right tenant, honestly, it drops down to 5%. Only because, like I said, we're looking for normalcy. If someone's offering you 6 months rent upfront, it usually means that there's a sob story behind it. Don't get me wrong, there are some sob stories that make sense, but oftentimes it doesn't. Another thing I do want to point out is technically you're not even allowed to take 6 months rent as deposit. As per landlord-tenant board, you're only allowed to take first month and last month's rent. Of course, if someone volunteers it and you accept it, it's all mutually agreed upon, everyone signs off on it, it's okay. But if a tenant did want to go ahead in the future and dispute that, they do actually have a right to. And they could possibly get their money back if the judge decides that yes, this amount of deposit was actually a bit too much for this lease. So like I said, the whole process involves a lot of conversations, it involves a lot of detective work, it actually involves a lot of work at our end to make sure that at the end of the day, the tenant that we're placing inside of the home is going to take care of the home. I'm sure Hussein's mentioned this in some of his videos in the past as well. Once you get a tenant into a home, it's really hard to take them out. So it's better to take a week or 2 weeks to be absolutely sure that you're comfortable with your tenant than to put them into place and then having to, spend money and time having to figure out what to do with them later. It's like I said, if you're listening to this, if you made it to the end of this video, you're already probably thinking, wow, that's a lot of work. I hope you found it very helpful. If you're a landlord that's looking to lease out your home and you're happy with what you sort of heard here, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you find a tenant that's suitable. And if not, then I hope you find it helpful in collecting the information at your end. Until next time, remember one thing, get Kabani, get sold.
Sell it, sell it, sell it, sell it, sold. Sell it, sell it, sell it, sell it, sold. Sell it, sell it, sell it, sell it, sold. Sell it, sell it, sell it, sold.